Good morning to everyone there from here, Bangalore, India. It is 7:30 in the morning here, a very pleasant morning here. And at the very outset, I am grateful to Professor Ronald Lee, Professor Andy Mason, Professor Sangyop Lee, and all other organizers of this wonderful virtual international conference on the NTA. I have three or multiple role in this conference. First, I am chairing this technical session, and also I was given the opportunity to organize this important session on the generational economy. Second, I have an opportunity to make a small presentation of my current research tomorrow in another technical session. But it is also important for me to thank you all for giving me an opportunity to participate in all the sessions of all the conference days here. So thank you very much for everyone there for giving me this opportunity. This technical session is focused on the generational issues, mainly in the context of Asian countries. There are 4 distinguished presentations. First by Michael on Philippines. Second by Anchi Tung and Kevin for Taiwan. Dr. Turo and Dayano on Indonesia. And finally, Debolina and Lystrom on India. And there are 2 discussants of this technical session. Dr. Suparanda from Thailand, and earlier, Dr. Fukui from the University of Tokyo was scheduled to be one of the discussants, but in view of his last-minute inconveniences, I shall be replacing him as one of the discussants of this technical session. This session has 4 presentations, and as per the allowed time, the duration is 1 hour and 15 minutes. And if you permit me, I shall outline in brief what shall be the time allocation for presenters, discussants, and the moderator. I request each presenter to limit the presentation up to 10 minutes and about 7 minutes or 7.5 minutes for each discussant. And that will give about 20 to 25 minutes for open discussion and question answer by participants from different countries across continents in this session. And finally, 1 or 2 minutes for the moderator to sum up the whole discussion of the session. Without much waiting, I shall invite each presenter to make his presentation in the same order as being announced on the conference agenda. Accordingly, I now request Dr. Michael to make his presentation on the interesting topic, how are generations related network structures in intergenerational transfers in the Philippines. It is over to you, Dr. Michael.
Thank you so much for the introduction. This topic was, I thought about this topic, well, because of Annie's presentation during the last session on the micro-distributional contributions on the generational economy. And for the most part, we're looking at transfers at the marginals and not the whole matrix of inflows and outflows across generations. And this is where I'm coming from. And I'm using here NTA for the Philippines from 1990 to 2015, so it's a period of 25 years. So we all know that transfer systems are important because it's an important source of financing consumption. And as shown by Professor Lee and Gretchen in the 2011 chapter, there is a strong regional pattern with the private transfers in this because of also the differences in public transfer systems. In East Asia and the Pacific, for example, as much as 88% of all consumption are financed through both public and private transfers. This is for Taiwan in 2010, and for as much as 61% for the elderly in China in 2007. In South and Southeast Asia, on the other hand, as much as 90% of children's consumption are financed through public and private transfers. That's Thailand in 2011, and as much as 22% for the elderly in Cambodia in 2009. Another important role of transfer systems is that it links different generations without explicit quid pro quo arrangements. So even without contracts that need to be enforced, somehow we have these roles that allows us to fulfill those gaps in the life cycle. However, much of what we know about transfers are based on how much generations receive from or provide to other cohorts in the economy in the margin. So what we know are, in total, how much each generation is getting or how much each generation is providing to others, to the whole economy. We are not really looking at how specific age groups are providing for or receiving from other cohorts in the economy. So this is what I'm saying when we say that we're just looking at the marginals for the most part. So this is the transfers per capita in the Philippines from 1990 to 2015. And here I'm showing it in constant 2015 pesos in thousands. C is for consumption, TF would be private transfers, IO would be inflows and outflows, TG would be public transfers. And like many of our Asian neighbors, private transfers dominate the Philippine transfer systems. Children rely substantially on transfers. So if you look at this part towards the younger ages, the red line, the red solid line would be the inflows, and that is almost as high as the consumption for children. However, for the elderly, this is less so. What can also be gleaned from this picture is that elderly are increasingly becoming net receivers of transfers. So there are net inflows to the elderly in more recent years compared to other years, especially in the 1990s and 1995, where it nets out to zero. So what they receive is almost how much they get, but now they are more likely to receive private transfers, and originally they were also net zero. Another way to look at it is looking at the direction of transfers and the wealth that can be expected from these transfers across a lifetime. So the idea is to identify what's the average age of transfer inflows and outflows. So this tells us the direction, whether it's going from the elderly, more aged generation to the younger generation, or from younger to older. And how much does an average person expect to receive throughout his or her lifetime? That is the idea of wealth. For the Philippines, as documented elsewhere, the flow of transfers is in general from the elderly to the younger generation. So in 1990s, for instance, the mean age of public transfer inflows is 45 years, while the outflows is 50 years. And throughout over the past 25 years, we can see dips and increases in those gaps. So from the 1990s, the gap is about 5 years, and then it increased around 2000, 2005, and now the gap is about 3 years. So from 50 to age 47 on average. For public transfer inflows, it's the reverse. You can see that there is a slight dip around 2000, 2005, and then there's an increase in the gap. So it's saying that those who receive transfers are younger, or are older, but then those who are sending the transfers are older, and the gap is increasing from early 2000s to 2015. In terms of how big the flows are, if we would look at the inflows if you add inflows for the private transfers and public transfers, about 80 to 90% of total consumption. So that's quite substantial. But aside from these idea of the marginals of the transfer system, we know that transfer systems are much more complicated because transfers are not usually anonymous, especially for private transfers, because for instance, in a household, you know that if you provide for your child, that is transfer from a parent or a grandparent to a child. Or if it's a public transfer system, although you don't have an idea of who specifically the person would be, you have a sense of what the government is paying for, and then you have an idea of where your money is going to. So for instance, if real estate taxes are used to pay for education, then at least you have an idea that somehow the younger generation is getting those real estate taxes. And these idea of transfers to and from different generations can be captured in these intergenerational transfers matrix that we can generate from our NTA data. The private transfers, this is essentially from the private intra-household transfers that we can generate from the microdata. For the public transfers, what I did was the idea is that all money of the government is pulled somewhere up there, and then it is distributed to someone else, and it's independent of who is giving. So what I did was to multiply the share of the marginals to arrive at this figure. And that makes sense in my head because, well, if the transfer systems are independent of who's paying and who's getting, you would expect to have these matrix. So in this matrix, on the x-axis, you have the outflow age group who is giving. And on the y-axis, you have the inflow age group who is receiving. And as you go from red to green to from blue to green to orange, you would expect that the percent of the total transfers going to that age group from the outflow age group to that inflow age group is increasing. And from 1990s, we can map that from 1990 to 2015, but I am only moving to 2000 and 2015. And what we can see here is that for the most part, the transfers, the outflows are mainly from those who are working, that is from those ages 20 to 60, and that a large part of that transfers for the public side goes to children less than 20 years old. But for the private transfers, this is more interesting because you have like three mountains. The one is on this side, lower part, where you have the age groups of parents giving to children. And then you have another group here around about age 20 to 60, going to around age 20 to 60 also, who are maybe parents or people living together who are sharing resources. And then another group here who are essentially children, young adults, providing for their maybe elderly parents aged 50 to 60. So we know that that different generations are intimately linked in this sense through the transfer systems, and that changing and that the linkages, the changing importance of a specific cohort or specific generation may be linked to how they go through the economic life cycle, as well as through other factors as well, including demographic change and public policy, although we would not be looking at it. Our goal here is to just describe the structure of the network in the Philippines. And so given this structure of linkages between and among generations, how do we summarize network structures? In this presentation, I'm only looking at two measures. One is spatial dependence, which essentially answers the questions, are transfers to or from proximal generations correlated? Are those peaks related with higher values for those surrounding that point? As well as I'm also looking at network centrality, which is which generation or age group is more important in this whole scheme of network. So now looking at spatial dependence, to measure spatial dependence, I'm borrowing from spatial statistics, Moran's I, to measure spatial autocorrelation. The idea is that this is, if I have a high value at one point, do I expect a relatively high value in surrounding areas? Okay, so this is similar to Pearson correlation, where you have negative 1 to 1, positive 1 would mean perfect spatial correlation. And from here, I'm plotting the spatial correlation for private and public transfers using the matrix that I've shown earlier from 1990 to 2015, and it shows that there is a strong spatial dependence for both public and private transfers across years. So the Moran's I is around 50 to 60%, although the values for the public transfer are slightly higher. And these suggest that there is clustering intergenerational flows. And these value summarizes that picture that I've shown earlier. In terms of network centrality, transfer systems are special and unlike many types of networks, because one, they are directed transfers. You know who from which generation and to what generation the money is going to, and the links are weighted. Some linkages are greater than the others, because there's an amount of the flow, and that there are many nodes as there are generations. Although generations are the main actor in these analyses may be expanded to include other classes like socioeconomic group and how these socioeconomic groups and generations are linked within the economy. In that sense, these limits what measures of network centrality may be used, because some measures of network centrality can only be used if it is undirected or it is unweighted, like shaking hands. Who have you shake hands with, for example? So that's a different kind of a network. So for this presentation, I'm looking at eigencentrality, which measures the influence of a node, in this case, a generation or age group in a network, in this case, a transfer system. So those linked to more important generations, that is the more central generation or cohort, are assigned higher weights. So if you have a higher weight, then it means that you are more important in this network of transfer systems. And this is what we get for the Philippines by age group, by year. So you see that young adults are generally more important or more central in the Philippine transfer systems. So the highest eigencentrality measures are for those ages 20, both for the public transfers and the private transfer systems. Although, as you can see here, between 1990 and 2015, there appears to be a shift towards older generations. I'm just not sure whether this is a shift, if this is following specific cohort, or if this is just a shift because of policy that's happening over the past 25 years. This is my last slide. From this presentation, we've seen that, and we know that transfer systems are not usually anonymous, and this allows us to look at transfer systems in a more nuanced ways, and there might be new insights from analysis of intergenerational transfer matrices rather than just looking at the marginals. So for me, this opens up some questions that we can look at in the future. Well, one is what other network structures may be extracted from NTA data, and based on these measures, are there something common or different across different countries or regions? And how will the network structure or transfer systems expected to change with demographic and or policy changes? In the case of the Philippines, will that shift in importance of different generations continue into the future? And finally, how can these network structures be leveraged to expand consumption, delivery of goods and services? So if there is a program, which generation should I choose if I want this to flow to the other generations of economy? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And as I have read the presentation of others, I can see what is different in this presentation from the rest, which I shall be summarizing at the beginning of my discussion note. Now, for the time being, let me invite the second presenter of this session, Dr. Anchi, in collaboration with Kevin Yu Ching. Over to you, Dr. Anchi.
Thank you for inviting us to present this half-baked paper. And since I have pre-recorded, can I ask Mari to play the video for me?
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to present a paper entitled Boomers versus Millennials, Who Owes How Much to Whom? This is a joint work by myself and Professor Kevin Xie. Our study began from the observations of generational divide. In the boomer blaming debate, millennials often accuse boomers of skewing policies toward their own interest at the expense of other generations. And boomers defend that they have worked hard to bring about huge improvements in living standards, which benefit all cohorts. This generation war seems to occur everywhere in the world, Taiwan no exception. In fact, some scholars in Taiwan consider those who are born in 1978 to 93 as the lost generation, who are considered as the victims of wealth gap and stagnant wages. Here in this study, we use NTA data to answer a simple economic question. Do some cohorts transfer more resources to other cohorts than they receive in lifetime? Specifically, we are asking, does a millennial lose out relative to a boomer, and by how much? We measure the net intergenerational transfer flows of two cohorts. But to our surprise, the millennials may not be losers. So we want to know how robust is this finding, and if it is robust, why is it? Method. We calculate lifetime intergenerational transfers as the sum total of net public transfers and net private transfers. Data. We have 30 years of NTA data, 1981 to 2016. We then follow the generational accounting method to project into the future and also into the past, so that we can cover the entire lifespans of those born in 1981 and those born in 1951. Here is a brief review of the rapid changes in Taiwan. Regarding economic growth, Taiwan has gone through the super high growth period to high growth and now low growth. Along this development, we also see longer schooling years and higher health spending. Regarding welfare, there have been very few social programs in the beginning. More are launched over time, but some are overly generous. So pension reforms have started since last year. Regarding demography, in 6 years, Taiwan will become a super-aged society with TFR equal to 1 today, which is in sharp contrast to TFR being close to 6 in 1960. Regarding family, the average size has shrunk substantially, and intra-household transfers shift towards kids along family nuclearization. Result. The left-hand side is for calendar year 2016, which has a normal shape, positive for children and elders, and negative for working ages. However, in the cohort diagram on the right-hand side, the children part is hardly visible, mainly because the income was very low in the past. This suggests that proper discounting is necessary. Here are the results for the two cohorts with discount rate 3 or 7%, all discounted to 2016 value. We then add up the numbers throughout the lifetime and adjust for survival rate. the result shows that for the 1981 cohort, they received positive lifetime intergenerational transfers, while the 51 cohort is a net payer in its lifetime. This is opposite to common belief. So we want to know if the result is robust. A first question to ask is whether the discount rate is appropriate. Actually, 3 or 5 or 7% are numbers often used, but they don't seem right in the case for Taiwan. For the 51 cohort, the pre-1981 projections look overly small even after discounting. Then for discount rate at 7%, the post-2016 projection also looks somewhat too small. So these numbers suggest that we need a better discounting scheme. Next, we look at how actual interest rate, GDP deflator, and GDP per capita growth rate compare with the fixed rates. One point to note is that in earlier decades, these rates are well above 7%, and in recent decades, they are well below 3%. This suggests that we may need a time-varying discount rate. So which rate to use? For theoretical considerations, by the Ramsey equation, rho is a function of a bunch of variables. But in this textbook example, there is usually a subscript t for rho. And empirically, time preference schedule is at times nonlinear. So in this study, we experiment with both fixed and time-varying rates. 2 cases are reported, the GDP growth rate and the fixed 3% rate. Result. When discounting at the GDP per capita growth rate, the 51 cohort now receives positive transfers in their lifetime rather than negative. However, the 81 cohort still receives more net transfer than the 51 cohort. Next, we look at ratios. For ease of comparison, we calculate net transfers as a percentage of lifetime labor income. But still, the 81 cohort receives a higher rate of total intergenerational transfer, and this is the case in many but not all cases at the more detailed level. Here are the graphical presentations for both discount rates. Discussion 1. We begin this study with the question, is the 81 cohort a loser regarding intergenerational transfers as commonly thought? The answer is no, because this cohort receives more transfers than it gives to other generations. Second, this cohort receives more than the 51 cohort in both present value as well as in ratio. And these statements hold true whether the discount rate is fixed or time varying. The second question is, why does the 81 cohort receive more transfers than the 51 cohort? The answer is rapid social, economic, and institutional changes. Note that by using the economic growth rate to discount, the income effect is already taken care of. So specifically, the 81 cohort received more transfers at childhood due to education expansion and family nuclearization. And this cohort will receive larger amount of public pensions at their old age because of new social programs such as national pension since year 2008. As for working ages, the 81 cohort pays a lower tax rate, but this is mostly an accounting reason, as they spent more years in schools and started working and paying taxes later. Also, their lifetime labor income is higher, making their tax rates look smaller. Finally, we want to know, why does our finding contradict popular impression? First, we measure lifetime transfers, yet an individual may care more about specific instance. For example, in 2016, the 81 cohort aged 35 is starting to face the hardships as a net payer, whereas the 51 cohort aged 65 has just entered the life stage to enjoy net inflows. Second, we measure intergenerational transfers only, but an individual may consider all types of transfers, including asset reallocation. Third, we consider current and known flows and situations, yet there are also worsened wealth gap, upcoming reforms, escalated uncertainties, which means there are more works to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anchi. Such a detailed and huge work reduced only in few slides and presented in a few minutes. Thank you very much for that best time management of the presentation.
Thank you.
Now, let me invite Dr. Turo and Diana. I think Diana will make the presentation on generations and demographic dividend. Diana, please.
Actually, Turo will present today.
Okay, so today Diana and I are going to present something that's probably not directly part of NTA, but is overlapped with it. It's about generations and demographic dividend. So this is the motivation. When we talk about generation, we usually talk about only cohort, like what Anchi just did before. But if we talk with other people or we look at the popular or media, generation usually talk about millennial or baby boomers or such like that. And we know that generation affect the economy through their size, preference, and others. And each generation has their own characteristics. Now, the issue is that for countries like Indonesia, we tend to simply adopt generational classification from the US because those terms actually reflect American experience that may or may not applicable to countries like Indonesia. That's why we do this research. And this research I forgot to mention that it's funded by the Bank Indonesian Institute, our central bank. The research question is, do generation based on American classification fit the Indonesian context and experience? And then, if not, how do we classify cohort into generations in Indonesia? And since this is NTA meeting, what is the effect of using generational value on demographic dividend using NTA framework? We use 10 variables from economic and labor variables, demographic, and also social variables. And the data came from a National Social Economic Survey, or SUSENAS, from 1995 to 2018, and National Labor Force Survey, or SAGRNAS, from 2000 to 2018. And there are two steps of method. The first is to calculate a specific profile for each cohort. And we also included GDP per capita there to control the changes in economy. And then we use similarity measure and grouping to classify cohort into generations. And for instance, Euclidean distance or cosine similarity that we will discuss later in Q&A if you're interested. This is an example. So proportion of entrepreneur by age and cohort. At age 25 Indonesia, for instance, the percentage for those who were born in 78 was close to 20%, but the number was only 12% for those who were born in 1993. So we try to see whether there is actually difference in generation between these two cohorts. Now, how similar are two cohorts? We can compare average values, extrema, cumulative level differences, or shapes. And we use the last two. Issue when comparing profile-based differences. often only partial age overlaps between cohort profile because of the survey availability and also because of the nature of the age. So less overlap for certain pairs of cohort. So what we did is to normalize per overlapping point and then compare them. This is an example of entrepreneurship. So measure reflects differences between two consecutive cohorts, and a peak in distance or dip in similarities signal a change. So those are things that we consider potential to start a new generations. Now, we do have 10 variables. So new generations defined by several closely occurring changes with time band of 3 to 5 years among those 10 variables. Result. It's quite interesting that the result shows the periodization of generation in Indonesia seems to resemble that of political period. In Indonesia, we have old order generation led by Soekarno, and then new order generation led by Suharto, Reformation, and then post-Reformation. And it seems that the generations classification follow that more or less. So old order generation started at 48, ended 69. New order started 70, ended 1990, and Reformation 1991 to 2000, and 2001 and later is the post-Reformation. And we did tests against survey data, and the results showed that the classification, the Indonesian classification, has lower coefficient of variations than the classification based on American classifications. It means that they group closely together than compared to using American classification. This is the graph of two classifications. And this is the size. So as we can see that if we use the Indonesian classification in 2020, for instance, the old order, about 22% still alive, while in comparison, if we use American classification, only 16% of baby boomers still alive. Now, we would like to see the effect on demographic dividend. Does separating population into generation affect demographic dividend, and especially specifically about the duration and the end year of the dividends. This is the using conventional NTA method. Indonesia will end its first dividend in 2025 and only start to enjoy the second dividend in 2040. Of course, this is pre-COVID calculation. Now, if we accommodate generations, how is it going to be? So using different age profile for different cohort, we simply, for simplification, use two cohorts or two age profile. The first one is the 2018 age profile for those who were born in 1991 and beyond. And we use this because many of variables start at age 15. And the second one is we constructed synthetic age profile to represent older cohort. We chose not to use, for instance, 2015 or 2012 because they might be biased toward the later generation. That's why we constructed this age profile. Based on assumption, portion of labor income to consumption increase over time, and the peak of labor income move to the right. So old age labor force participation rate decreases. And the gray one is the synthetic, the yellow one is the 2018 age profile. So this is the result. Using age profile for different generation would push the first dividend to 2028 compared to 2025 in the conventional one. And then using or accommodating generation will actually pull the second dividend to start earlier in 2029 compared to 2040 in conventional NTA calculation. So in conclusion, general classification may vary across countries, not necessarily following that of the US. This especially applicable for the Indonesian case and might also be for other developing countries as well. Different generation may bring different preference and experience reflected in each profile, and the dividend periods recognized in different generation may be longer than suggested by the conventional measure. And for future works, we are thinking to find behavior that might affect the consumption and labor income profiles so that we can really use them, and then use more than 2 generations. It simply means more work because especially to capture the older generation. And we will be happy to hear your question and comments. Mahalo.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a new way of looking at the intergenerational analysis, because you have tried to endogenize the identification and classification of the generation, and also beautifully linked with the issue of estimating the first and second demographic dividend. And also elsewhere in your slide, I also find that you have made a reference to the third demographic dividend. They are quite new and welcome. So thank you very much for that nice presentation. Now let me invite the fourth and the last presentation of this technical session by Debolina and Laisram Ladu Singh. And I presume that Debolina will make the presentation of this joint paper.
Thank you so much for giving this opportunity. I am presenting our paper titled "Does Post-2005 Policy Reform Have Changed Means of Support for the Elderly in India, Quantifying by NTA?" Sorry. Starting with the demographic transitions that world population is going under through the changes from high fertility, high mortality to low fertility and mortality. And during this transitions period, the age structure of the population undergoes unprecedented changes from broad-based pyramid to sinking base, with the enlarging middle positions and expanding top. And the consequence of these age structure transition is populations aging, and with this population two population pyramid, with this pictorial form, we can see that India is not an exception, and India is currently going through this age transitions process. So before going to my paper, I am showing some facts and figures regarding the elderly populations in India. The total number of elderly populations is increasing drastically, and now it is 104 million, which is 8% of the total populations. According to that, decadal growth rate of the elderly populations is also increasing after 2001. Whether the total populations is showing decreasing trend. And coming to the dependency ratio, the dependency ratio is increasing. Initially it was increasing, after that it showing the declining trend, but after 2001 it is again showing increasing trend due to the old age dependency ratio. And there are some other profiles, that is sex ratio and literacy rates also increasing over the time. For India, marital status of the elderly populations is a very significant one. So we can see from these pictures that the currently married elderly woman is significantly low compared to the male populations. So let me tell you that India is following the joint family system, where people used to enjoy, elderly people used to enjoy the head of the family role. But due to the phenomenon of globalizations, modernizations and urbanizations, these integrations of joint family system has strongly impacted the status of elderly, which for those reasons, the elderly populations are growing through some economic, physical, psychological and social challenges. Here I am mentioning some social security system in India, but the main fact is there doesn't exist any kind of universal social security measure for elderly in India. Only 12% of the population is covering by the social security net. among them they are and the 12% people who are actually receiving these benefits are actually working in the organized sector, and there are some other targeted program which actually cover elderly populations, but not much significant. But post policy 2005 policies, Indian government has initiated different kind of social security act for unorganized sector. I have mentioned those important one, and another flagship program is NRHM and Manrega Act, which actually covers the elderly populations in rural India. So coming to my objectives, given this background, my objective is to analyze whether post 2005 policy reform have improved the social security for elderly in India first, and secondly, how private and public transfers work together to meet the consumptions inequality. Three types of data have been used for this analysis. One, census data for 2 rounds. We are calculating for census data is used for the single age populations. Macro aggregate controls for the consumptions and labor income are computed from the national statistical accounts, and ISDS 2 rounds are using for the micro data. The study has followed the basic national transfer account methodology. Now coming to the main findings of my paper. Here I am showing the labor income and consumptions of the 2 consecutive years. The first picture is showing the per capita labor income of 2 consecutive years to capturing the effect of 2005 or post 2005 policy initiation. And during this period, we can see that the per capita profile of 2011-12 is higher in most part of the life cycle compared to the 2005. And another important feature is in 2004, the labor income reaches its peak at the age of 58 years. But for 2011-12, it is 1.3 times higher of the per capita income of 30 to 49 years, which actually indicating the fact that there is increasing employment opportunity for the opportunity and enhancement of the labor income. And another picture is showing the consumption per capita consumption pattern of the 2 consecutive periods, and there are 2 major findings we can find from these pictures, that the 2011-12 per capita consumptions profile is declining from the age 35, and it continues through 75, and then it's increasing. On the other side, for the young populations, the private and public consumption is raised by 64% of per capita income of 30 to 49 years. So it is it can be concluded from that post policy reform is biased towards the elderly young populations compared to the elderly populations. The excess consumptions over labor income is actually presented the LCD, is defined the LCD, and the U-shaped curve is showing the LCD of the 2 consecutive years. And if we look at the 2011-12 LCD curve, we can see there is some reduction in the LCD, compared to the 2004-5. That is because of the coupling effect of the enhancing employment opportunity as well as the decreasing consumption of the 2011-12, which is showing by this line. The LCD can be mitigated by the private and public transfers as well as asset-based reallocations. Here the 2 picture of showing the net public transfer and net public and private transfers, where if we compare the 2 pictures, we can see that the net public transfer is very negligible compared to the private transfers, and young populations mostly dependent on their the private transfer is mostly dominated the LCD compared to the public transfer. Now the first picture is showing the net intra-household transfers, or it is called the familial transfers, where the resources can go through this go through the family members. Here we can see that the main providers of this contributors of this case is the prime working age group, and the main beneficiaries are the young populations. And another major fact is rather receiving the beneficiary from the prime working age group, they are actually contributed to the dependent members of the family. And the two stack diagram is actually telling about the public and private transfer age pattern of the public transfer inflow and outflow for the 2 consecutive periods. And here we can see the prime working age populations are the basic taxpayers. And this is the most important picture of the intergenerational economy, where resources flow from young to old and from old to young. And it is showing that the young populations, the LCD of the young populations is fully made by the private and public transfer systems, whereas the elderly populations is solely rely on the asset income. That's why after 60 plus populations, the asset based reallocation has increased abruptly, and the public and in terms of the public transfer, this is very negligible compared to the private transfer. And also, as well as we can see that private as well as public transfers cannot cover up the elderly life cycle deficit. Mostly they are not covering the life cycle deficit of the elderly. Elderly will sustain with their consumptions by the asset based reallocations. So coming to the conclusions, we can conclude in this way that post-2005 policy increases the opportunity of the employment and income enhancement, but it could not able to meet the consumption needs as so far. And public transfer is very inadequate to meet the LCD and biased towards the young populations. And elderly has to rely on their asset-based reallocations. So in policy point of view, the government should provide the increased in employment opportunity for elderly in India, and strengthening the social security measures as well as affordable healthcare facilities.
So thank you very much. Thank you. And I know the data challenges of constructing the national transfer accounts for India, like that of other developing countries, and in spite of those limitations and challenges, you have been able to construct the accounts for 2011 and 12, so that comparison is now possible between 2004-5 and 2011 and 12.
Yes.
And a lot of things go in between, and that is really another challenge to explain why those changes have taken place. We will come back to more discussion later.
Okay.
Now all the 4 presentations have been completed. Now I request our friend Dr. Supananda Lohachai from Thailand to give her discussant's remarks on these 4 presentations.
Thank you, Professor Narayana, and thank you for inviting me into this session. For all of the 4 papers are very interesting, and it's very something that is really new, especially to, especially for the case of Thailand, I've never seen this kind of analysis done in Thailand before. So this is all very interesting and very, exciting for me to get to, get to listen to your presentation and get to see all of your presentations today. So I guess I'll go one by one in the order of presentation, and please correct me if I go in the wrong order. So for for Michael's paper, it's hang on. it's yes, it's very interesting, and it's, I think it's the pattern is quite familiar in with the case of Thailand, but what you did with the study on the transfer system, and by showing the gaps, you know, between like inflows and outflows, and separating into private and public inflows, that part is very interesting. And but could you sort of explain or elaborate more onto sort of, is there any explanation to why the gaps between, you know, the gaps of the private is becoming narrower, and the gaps for the public has become widened over time, the fields that you showed earlier. And also for the network centrality that you mentioned, that the graph really showed, the result really showed that the young adults, you know, in their 20s, in the 1990s, are very important in the Philippines transfer systems, and then it sort of moved a little toward more of older ages, when the time goes to, like, you know, 2015, and you said that it might has to do with, you know, like it followed the same cohort in that in that graph, you know, it's I'm not sure, like could you maybe sort of explain, is there any explanation or whatever to as to why it is sort of in the 20s at the very beginning? Because I know it might have to do with, you know, like the ages when you start working and stuff, but I was kind of, you know, like my intuition would think that it would be sort of more into the 30s instead of 20s. So I'm not sure whether there's any explanation to it. So if you maybe look at look at it or whatever, it might be also interesting. And now moving on to presentation of Dr. Anchi. So yes, this is also very interesting. It's, I think it's pretty much reflects what has been going on also in Thailand. There's been some similar debates on, you know, blaming between generations stuff, and I really like at the very end when you conclude that it also has to do with, you know, like people maybe looking at it at one point in time more than, you know, like sort of looking at it as over a lifetime span, like the NTA shows. And also I also like what you did with the, you know, like the discounting rate, and then changing the discounting rates to reflect more of of the real situation, and gives a better understanding of you know of the NTA patterns, you know, like the life cycle deficits patterns and stuff. A little just a little bit when we also did the projections like you did in this work, you know, using, you know, like I see when you did your projections, you used the 2016 age pattern for the 1981 cohort, projecting to in the future, and then for cohort 1951, you use the 1981 age pattern going backward, and then 2016 projecting forward, right? We also did something similar in Thailand, and we get this a very interesting result as well. Sort of lucky for us, we also have another study done by Dr. Chalermpon. You guys might be also familiar with him. He is from Mahidol University, and he also did the same projection, but what he did is a little bit more detailed. He break he break population into 48 groups by, you know, like marital status, education level, and I can't remember the other one. Hang on. and size of household, and it comes up with 48 groups and then 48 age profiles. And then the way he did was that he project how these group, the population in this group the proportion of them will be in the future first, and then he did the projection with the NTA. So the results are I think it will be even more interesting if similar kind of breaking down, you know, like groupings, it might better reflect the projections in a more, you know, like, well, we don't know what the future is, but it might be more better, you know, reflect of what we think the future will be. Something. Okay. Okay. Now moving to the paper of Indonesia with Dr. Toro. Yes, this is something we, at least I never thought of. You know, we always follow American classification, and we also, you know, it's we sort of think that it would reflect somehow, or it might be just a little bit like overlap or whatever. But then we think that it like for Thailand, we usually just assume that it's it follows American classification, or it might be just a little bit like a few years different. But your work on, you know, like how you define the new cohort with you know, like many characteristics, that is very interesting, and it really is interesting, and maybe we would like to try that with Thailand sometimes, but we don't know when, but hopefully we will get to try that as well. I didn't quite get a lot of notes for myself on your presentation. I'm sorry, but I think for what you did, you already incorporate, like characteristics and, like their behaviors or their, like generational characteristics on, like savings or taste or behavior into your analysis. I'm not sure whether you did that or not, but I think like for the case of Thailand, and the problem of like generations, like new generations in Thailand, is that I don't know if it's the same with other countries, but new generations tend to, like they don't save. They tend to just, when they have money, they spend it all and stuff like that, and they don't really they didn't really look at the future that much. There isn't any, like public system, like pension system for them to rely on in Thailand, but they don't seem to care about that. They seem to care about today or whatever. And I'm not sure whether you incorporate that into your new categorization of the cohorts or generations, but I think that really sort of would really have a impact on like NTA patterns, like consumption patterns, and also the transfer patterns for the country as a whole. And yes, that's it. Also, really like the how you relate this to the first and second demographic dividend. So that would really have a great implication, when we look at the dividends, because if you look at it in the same way that we looked at, then it gives somehow a different implication for the policy as well. So that was very interesting. Thank you. And for the last one, right? That's for India. Okay, and Dr. Debolina. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Okay, so for your paper, and of course for a country like India, is always very interesting, and especially when you show the characters and the of or marital status of the male and female elderly in India, and that is really important. I'm sure for like policies or whatever, because it really shows who the policy should focus on in order to give them income security and to take care of them when they are old. And so that's very interesting. And but India seems to have done quite a lot in the post-2005 policies. And as your result shows, is really gave a big impact on on their incomes and on their like transfers, and especially their role as a household head, or like the leadership in the family. And that's also something that is important for like elderly in Thailand as well. So that is very interesting. I have one little bit of question though on the consumption pattern of between 2004 and 2011, but before, as Professor Narayana has also mentioned, that it was difficult to sort of do a comparison between the 2 years. So I think my question might have to do with that data issue or whatever. But just a little bit of things that I noticed that, you know, how the consumptions of the older age in 2011 is sort of lower compared to the 2004. Have you looked at the types of the consumption? You know, like, is it health or is it other consumption? And if it's other consumption, what kind of consumption specifically? Because I think it might better explain that, you know, for example, like in Thailand, nowadays, the consumption of the older generations, the elderly has sort of goes up. I think that's common, but it's mainly on health expenditure, and that has to do with the new policies in Thailand that you know, try to, well, we have a universal health coverage, so everyone has access to healthcare system. But the problem before was that elderly were not able to bring themselves to hospitals, you know, because it's far or whatever. And then, so for the past, you know, probably about 5 or 10 years, probably 5 years in Thailand, the policy has been, had very much to do with how to get them to the hospital, or how to get them to the healthcare, like get them into the healthcare system or services. And so by that policy, the healthcare consumption of the elderly has shot up in Thailand, something like that. I mean, it's easier for Thailand because it's a health, but if it's the other consumption, it might be, you know, might be a bit difficult to explain or whatever. But I think it might be worth looking at it if it's not an issue of the data per se. Okay, and yes, and also that I think it's very interesting, and I think it's also reflect what it is. The system is similar to Thailand. Is that, you know, our elderly are always net intra-household payers, and that's a very important role, and I'm glad to see that in India as well. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that insightful discussion of each presentation separately. And okay, now let me skip my discussant's remarks and straight away go for the discussion time for the participants. And I suggest that the presenters can take on the discussion's points and the participants' points together while giving reply at the end. Now, all the 4 presentation and the discussions remark is open for discussion. And I see here technology guiding me about the total number of participants. About 25 are participating in this session, and excluding the presenters and the discussants, I think we have not less than 18 different participants across countries and across continent. So it is important for me to open the time for their questions and discussion. The session is now open for discussions by participants.
Quick points. First on Chitung's presentation. We did something closely related for the US in a PDR paper in 2010. We also found that public education and the increase in educational attainment and therefore expenditures per child just dominates in terms of what a generation gets over its lifetime. Because if you get $1 when you're young, it's worth $10 in benefits when you're old, which you may not survive to claim and which is heavily discounted. So we also found the surprising result that the generations that were thought to be suffering and being robbed were actually the ones who did best of all. That was the point. And the second is I wanted to ask Debolina, well, this is just because we see this in many countries, and I don't understand it in any of the, I guess it's particularly in the Southeast Asian countries where asset income is extremely important for elderly people. And not only do they pay their own consumption, but often they're helping their children and grandchildren. What are the assets that the elderly hold? Is this just, is it a farm and farm animals and structures? Or I don't know how to think about the assets and what that really means. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful presentations. One question for Professor Dr. Anchi Tong and Dr. Xie on Taiwan, which is the role of expectation. I think what you described is what you could call reality. But is there an issue of expectation? For instance, we know in the United States, the current young people, their salary compared with their parents' generation is actually slightly lower in the relative terms. And the baby boomers compared with their generation, their parents, were 30–40% higher. So it could be a matter of expectation. So I just have a question about explanation of this puzzle. And I have a quick question, clarification for Michael Abrigo on your presentation. What's the unit of analysis? Were those age groups when you did the network stuff, or individuals? If they were age groups, it seemed to be that way. They are not the same people who are making the transfers, even though we're trying to say they are network, right? So those are the questions. Thank you.
Now let me invite each presenter to give a short reply, and I request each presenter not to take more than 2 minutes to respond to the questions of the participants and the discussion. May I now start with Dr. Michael? Dr. Michael? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rayana.
Yeah, quick, yeah.
Quick. For one thing, the unit of analysis for our age groups. So yes, these are not the same people, but we can follow them. We can do a synthetic cohort and follow them through as they move through the life cycle. On the question of Pearl, well, in the Philippines, we know that public and private, and elsewhere, we know that public and private transfers are intimately linked, and there's some indication of substitution between public and private transfers, at least in the Philippines, based on the time series that we have. And patterns of asset holdings, consumption and income, and of public pension and other transfer systems do not favor the elderly more recently, unfortunately. And essentially what's happening with the mean ages of private transfer inflow is that private transfers is taking up the slack in the public transfers, and that is pulling the mean ages of private transfers higher in more recent years. About your other question, the first thing that I thought about is that the change in the importance of age groups, that these may be related to the changes in the delays in childbearing across the past 25 years. But when I look at the data, it has not much changed over the past 25 years. So what I'm thinking now is that these may be because of the differences in resources available to different cohorts. In the 1990s, the Philippines is largely agricultural, and this is mostly among the older generations, and those who are younger are starting to go into services and manufacturing, which has expanded in more recent years. So I guess that's the story that I'm seeing.
Thank you. Dr. Anchi?
I'll be quick. Thank you all. And as for the discussion, we of course, need to do more refinement in the projection. Thank you. And as for Ron's question, actually, this is exactly the next step. We are looking, we will try to dig deeper about education's role, especially when it is, it matters about human capital investment. And as for Professor Wanfan's question, excellent question. We try to sort of include that into our consideration of the discounting rate, but this is very quantitative. So we are still thinking about ways to look at that, the different expectation, because the for the 51 cohort, they grew up in poverty, then they get richer, but for the 81 or even the younger cohorts, they grew up in prosperity, but then they are facing a very dark future. So that's going to affect the discounting scheme, and also in other more delicate way. Thank you. I will definitely think about it. Okay, that's.
Thank you. Dr. Thuro?
Thank you, especially for the discussion. Yeah, we're actually looking forward that other countries, especially developing countries, also do the same as we did, because we would like to know if actually those classifications really matters and different from one country to another. So it's not just adopting American experience. And we would like to see also the similar work being applied to demographic dividend or other variable in NTA frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Debolino?
Thank you so much. I'm coming to my first questions, that is the consumptions is showing the decreasing trend. Actually, when I divided the consumptions expenditure in three sectors, education, health, and other, the 2011-12 actually showing that there is a higher expenditure in the educations, but health consumptions is declining continuously, but I don't know what happened, but maybe some data problems, because we do not have that much of data, only we have to depend on the ISDS data for the micro data, but when I calculating the 2011-12 for this consumption, it is showing that education consumption is increasing drastically, but the health consumption is decreasing for the elderly populations, but for the young populations the consumption for health is increasing, but for elderly it is decreasing somehow, and I'm not able to find what is the exact reason of this declining consumptions. And another thing, the young populations is showing the increasing consumptions. They are also contribute, other consumption is also contributing this fact. And sorry, because of some technical problem, I couldn't able to hear the Professor Ron questions actually.
Okay.
And so could you please?
Yes, please.
Yes, I was asking in what you showed, in some ways similar to what I've seen for other South Asian, Southeast Asian countries, the asset income of the elderly is very high, and it's used not only to fund consumption, but also sometimes to fund transfers to younger family. And I just want to know how to think about the assets that the elderly hold. What is it that is generating the income? Is this farms, farm animals, structures, things like this? Or is this all the urban population? Any ideas you have on that, I'd be very interested to hear. Thank you.
Maybe in rural area, the elderly populations are actually acquiring the agricultural field, lot of agricultural field, as well as their properties which they inherited from the other generations. So maybe that creates that building asset for the rural populations, but in urban area they only have to rely on their labor income in their primary age groups. So maybe I'm not sure about that, how they are building, but maybe they are inheriting some assets to transfer their younger generations in that way.
If permissible,
Thank you.
Yeah.
We had a similar problem of explaining the high asset income for the elderly generation way back 2004-5 data. And we had explained that particular phenomenon in regard to the accumulation of wealth by people at later ages. So it is not in the early ages people start accumulating assets and wealth, but it is only at the later stages. And large number of people are not dependent on the formal retirement income by way of public pension, and because they may have worked in the unorganized sectors, self-employed people, and there are many competing factors which explain why assets are accumulated at later ages in India and why asset income becomes a very dominant source for the elderly population. So we had some evidence for 2004-5 data. Now the new NTA is being constructed by Debolina and Lado Singh for 2011-12, and we really want to see how transition has taken place in terms of asset ownership at later ages, whether that could explain or strengthen our argument that asset income continues to be a major source of financing deficit consumption in India. That is a simple explanation I have from the past research. Okay, now I think it is time for me to close this session, and on behalf of the organizers of the conference there and on my personal behalf, I thank each presenter and each collaborator of that research presentation and the discussant and the participation by distinguished scholars across countries and continent in this session. Thank you very much everyone for that. It is also important for me to thank Miss Mary Chang, who has been giving a big support, technical support, back behind the screen. And she must be having a larger team to support this entire exercise. And technologically, she has been able to connect people and ideas across countries and across continent. A big thanks to her as well from the participants of this seminar. Very sorry, Dr. Sangyop, I was not very efficient in managing the time. That was only because I could see the enthusiasm of the presenters who had done so much of work behind the presentation. And although they did manage the time well, but I really did not want to exercise my chairman's prerogative and stop the presentation. Kindly excuse me for that, but I think that delay has given us a rich dividend in terms of learning and taking the NTA research further in Asia. Thank you very much.